Under the grey sky of a cold morning, a funeral procession moves silently through the deserted cemetery. Beside the small white coffin, a restless German shepherd paces around the gravediggers. The mother, supported by two women, can barely stand. As the shovels begin to throw earth, the dog leaps, biting metal and stopping any movement. The priest stands motionless, holding his hat as the silence grows heavier. The men step back, but do not leave. The animal tears off. A piece of the coffin's lid, revealing something no one expected to see. For a second, no one breathes. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thanks for watching. Now back to our story. The grey clouds hung heavy over the small town of Millbrook Springs on that sorrowful Tuesday morning, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the grief in every heart. The cemetery, usually a place of quiet reflection, buzzed with an unusual tension as families and friends gathered for what they believed would be a final farewell ceremony for baby Emma Grace Thompson. Women dressed in dark clothing clutched tissues to their eyes, while men stood with shoulders heavy under the weight of collective sorrow. Margaret Thompson, Emma's grandmother, stood at the front of the gathering, her weathered hands trembling, as she held a small white rose. At 68, she had seen her share of life's trials, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her daughter-in-law, Sarah Thompson, remained conspicuously absent from the ceremony, claiming she was too devastated to attend. This absence had already begun to raise whispers among the townspeople. The most striking presence at the gathering, however, was neither human nor expected. A magnificent German shepherd named Duke had appeared at the cemetery gates just as the ceremony began. No one knew who the dog belonged to, but his imposing stature and intelligent amber eyes suggested he was no ordinary stray. From the moment he arrived, Duke displayed behavior that puzzled everyone present. Reverend Michael Harrison, a kind man in his 50s who had served the Millbrook Springs community for over 20 years, tried to maintain the solemnity of the occasion despite the growing unease. He had performed countless ceremonies throughout his career, but something about this particular gathering felt different. The small white casket sat before them, surrounded by flowers, yet an inexplicable tension filled the air. Duke began circling the casket with deliberate steps, his nose close to the ground as if searching for something specific. His behavior was neither aggressive nor playful. Instead, it seemed purposeful, almost protective. When the cemetery workers, led by Foreman Tom Bradley, approached with their shovels to begin the burial process, Duke positioned himself directly between them and the casket. "Someone needs to control that animal," muttered Harold Winters, a longtime resident known for his impatience with anything that disrupted order. His wife, Dorothy, placed a calming hand on his arm, but her own eyes reflected the growing concern shared by many attendees. Young Jessica Martinez, who worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, found herself studying Duke's behavior with professional curiosity. Something about the dog's actions reminded her of search and rescue animals she had seen in training videos during her nursing education. Duke wasn't simply being disruptive. He was trying to communicate something important. As Reverend Harrison attempted to continue with the ceremony, reading from his well-worn prayer book, Duke's restlessness intensified. The dog began pawing at the ground near the casket, occasionally looking up at the gathered crowd as if trying to convey an urgent message. His whimpering grew more pronounced, causing several attendees to shift uncomfortably. Eleanor McKinney, Margaret's longtime friend and confidant, leaned closer to whisper, "That dog's been hanging around the hospital for the past few days. I saw him there when I visited my sister. Strange that he'd show up here too." This comment caught the attention of Dr. Patricia Wells, who had recently started working at the local medical center. She remembered seeing a German shepherd near the hospital parking lot, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, seeing the same dog at this ceremony, she began to wonder if there might be a connection. The cemetery workers grew increasingly frustrated as Duke refused to allow them to proceed. Every time they approached the burial site, the dog would position himself protectively, his low growls serving as a clear warning. Tom Bradley, who had been handling burials for 15 years, had never encountered such persistent animal interference. "Maybe we should postpone this until we can figure out what's wrong with the dog," suggested Janet Coleman, a teacher at the local elementary school who had always been fond of animals. Her suggestion was met with mixed reactions from the crowd. Margaret Thompson, however, seemed transfixed by Duke's behavior. Despite her grief, she found herself studying the animal's actions with growing interest. There was an intelligence in the dog's eyes that reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what it was. Her late husband had always said that animals possessed an intuition that humans often overlooked. As the tension mounted, Duke suddenly stopped his circling and sat directly in front of the casket, his alert gaze fixed on Margaret. The crowd fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. The dog's posture suggested he was waiting for something or someone to understand his message. Dr. Wells stepped forward cautiously, her medical training compelling her to observe the situation more closely. She had always believed that animals could sense things humans missed, and Duke's behavior suggested he was responding to something specific about this particular ceremony. "Has anyone verified the burial documentation?" she asked quietly, her question causing a ripple of surprised murmurs through the gathering. It wasn't the type of question typically asked at such ceremonies, but the unusual circumstances seemed to call for unusual considerations. Reverend Harrison paused in his reading, uncertain how to respond. He had received the burial request through normal channels and hadn't thought to question the paperwork. However, Dr. Wells's inquiry, combined with Duke's persistent behavior, began to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. The dog's presence had transformed what should have been a straightforward farewell ceremony into something much more complex. As the morning sun struggled to break through the grey clouds, the gathering found themselves facing questions they hadn't expected to ask, with a determined German shepherd serving as their unlikely guide toward answers that would soon change everything they thought they knew about little Emma Grace Thompson. Dr. Wells's question about the burial documentation hung in the air like morning fog, creating an uncomfortable silence that seemed to amplify Duke's continued presence at the casket. The German shepherd remained motionless, his intelligent eyes scanning the faces of the gathered crowd as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Reverend Harrison cleared his throat nervously, his usual confidence shaken by the unusual circumstances. "Well, I received the standard paperwork from the Thompson family through their representative," he said carefully, glancing toward the parking area where a black sedan sat apart from the other vehicles. Everything appeared to be in order. Margaret Thompson's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "Representative?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "I wasn't aware we had hired any representative. Sarah handled all the arrangements herself, or at least that's what she told me." This revelation caused a murmur of concern to ripple through the gathering. Eleanor McKinney stepped closer to her friend, placing a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Maybe you misunderstood, dear. Grief can make things confusing." However, Margaret's expression suggested otherwise. Despite her age, her mind remained sharp, and she had always been meticulous about family matters. The idea that important decisions had been made without her knowledge troubled her deeply. Duke suddenly stood and began walking toward the black sedan, his nose working actively as he approached the vehicle. The dog's behavior drew everyone's attention to the car, which none of them had particularly noticed before. Through the tinted windows, they could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. Tom Bradley, the cemetery foreman, seized the opportunity to approach the casket, while Duke was distracted. However, the moment he touched his shovel to the ground, Duke spun around and raced back, positioning himself once again between the workers and the burial site. This time, his warning growl was more pronounced, causing Tom to step back quickly. "I've never seen anything like this," Tom muttered to his assistant Kevin Murphy, a young man who had recently started working at the cemetery. "It's like that dog knows something we don't." Dr. Wells found herself increasingly intrigued by the situation. Her medical background had taught her to look for patterns and inconsistencies, and several things about this ceremony were beginning to concern her. The absence of Sarah Thompson, the mysterious representative, and most notably, Duke's unwavering determination to protect the casket, all suggested that something was amiss. Jessica Martinez, the nurse, moved closer to Dr. Wells. "Doctor, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "I was working the night shift at the hospital 3 days ago when Emma was brought in. The family was told she needed immediate specialized care that we couldn't provide here in Millbrook Springs." Dr. Wells' attention sharpened. "What kind of specialized care?" "They said she needed to be transferred to Children's Hospital in the city for advanced treatment. But here's what's strange. I never saw any transfer paperwork completed, and I would have been involved in that process. And This information sent a chill through Dr. Wells. Hospital transfer procedures were strictly regulated, and any movement of a patient, especially an infant, required extensive documentation. The absence of such paperwork was highly irregular and potentially serious. Meanwhile, Margaret Thompson had decided to approach the black sedan herself. Despite Eleanor's protests, the elderly woman walked determinedly toward the vehicle, her cane tapping rhythmically against the cemetery's paved pathway. Duke noticed her movement and trotted alongside her, as if providing escort and protection. When Margaret reached the car, she tapped on the window with her cane. After a moment's hesitation, the window rolled down to reveal a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit and dark sunglasses. His appearance was polished, but somehow unsettling, and he seemed surprised to see Margaret approaching. "Excuse me," Margaret said with the authority that comes from decades of life experience, "but I understand you're representing my family in some capacity. I'm Emma's grandmother, and I'd like to know exactly what arrangements you've made on our behalf." The man's composure faltered slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Robert Blackwood from Blackwood Legal Services. Your daughter-in-law retained our firm to handle the arrangements. Everything is being taken care of according to her wishes." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Sarah never mentioned hiring any legal service. In fact, she told me she was handling everything personally. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Robert Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at Duke, who had positioned himself beside Margaret and was watching the man with obvious suspicion. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. These situations can be very stressful for families. Dr. Wells, who had been listening to this exchange from a distance, decided to join the conversation. Her medical credentials often gave her authority in difficult situations, and she sensed that her presence might help clarify things. "Mr. Blackwood," she said as she approached, "I'm Dr. Wells from the medical center. I'm concerned about some inconsistencies regarding the patient transfer documentation. Could you help clarify the timeline of events?" The lawyer's discomfort became more obvious. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, doctor. My firm only handles legal arrangements, not medical matters." "Me. But surely you would have needed medical documentation to proceed with burial arrangements." Dr. Wells pressed gently but firmly. Standard protocols require proper medical certification before any cemetery can accept remains. Reverend Harrison, who had been watching this conversation unfold, decided to contribute his own concerns. Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you could show us the documentation you mentioned. I'd like to review it again to ensure everything is properly in order. The request clearly made Robert Blackwood uncomfortable. He fumbled in his briefcase, producing a folder that he handed to the Reverend with obvious reluctance. As Reverend Harrison began examining the papers, his expression grew increasingly troubled. "These signatures," he said slowly, looking up at Dr. Wells. "They don't match the ones I have on file from previous medical certifications from our local doctors, and the dates seem inconsistent." Duke, as if sensing the growing tension, let out a sharp bark that drew everyone's attention back to the casket. The dog had returned to his protective position, but now he was pawing more insistently at the ground around the burial site. His behavior suggested an increasing urgency, as if time was running out for something important. Jessica Martinez stepped forward, her nursing training compelling her to speak up. "There's something else I need to share," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "The night Emma was brought to the hospital, I overheard a conversation between two people in the parking lot. They were discussing financial matters related to the Thompson family, something about inheritance and life insurance policies." This revelation caused an audible gasp from several attendees. Margaret Thompson's face went pale as she processed the implications of what Jessica had just revealed. "Are you suggesting," Margaret said slowly, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear, "that someone has been making arrangements for my granddaughter based on financial considerations, rather than medical necessity?" The question hung in the air as Robert Blackwood started his car engine, clearly preparing to leave. However, Duke had other plans. The German Shepherd moved swiftly to position himself behind the vehicle, making it impossible for the lawyer to back out without risking harm to the animal. As the confrontation escalated, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, painting a picture that none of them had expected when they arrived for what they thought would be a simple farewell ceremony. The standoff between Duke and Robert Blackwood's sedan created a dramatic tableau that none of the cemetery attendees would soon forget. The German Shepherd stood firm behind the vehicle, his muscular frame blocking any escape route, while inside the car, the lawyer's agitation became increasingly apparent through his nervous movements and frequent glances in his rearview mirror. Sheriff David Rodriguez, who had been patrolling the area, noticed the unusual gathering at the cemetery and decided to investigate. As his patrol car pulled through the gates, the sight that greeted him was unlike anything he had encountered in his 15 years of law enforcement in Millbrook Springs. A crowd of people stood around a small casket, with a large dog preventing a man in an expensive car from leaving the premises. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked as he approached the group, his hand resting casually on his radio in case backup became necessary. Margaret Thompson, drawing strength from years of dealing with difficult situations, stepped forward to address the sheriff. "Sheriff Rodriguez, I believe we may have a serious situation involving my granddaughter, Emma. There are questions about the legitimacy of the arrangements that have been made without my family's knowledge." Dr. Wells joined the conversation, her medical credentials lending weight to the concerns being raised. "Sheriff, we've discovered several inconsistencies in the medical documentation, and there are questions about whether proper procedures were followed regarding the patient transfer that supposedly took place 3 days ago." Sheriff Rodriguez listened carefully as various members of the group shared their observations and concerns. The story that emerged painted a troubling picture of potentially fraudulent documentation, unauthorized legal representation, and financial motivations that seemed to override family wishes and medical protocols. Duke, meanwhile, remained vigilant at his post behind the sedan, occasionally looking toward the casket as if checking to ensure it remained undisturbed. His behavior had become a source of fascination for several children who had accompanied their parents to the ceremony, though their parents kept them at a respectful distance from the unfolding drama. Robert Blackwood finally rolled down his window again, his composure notably strained. "Sheriff, I'm simply here as a legal representative handling arrangements for the Thompson family. If there are questions about documentation, I'm sure they can be resolved through proper channels." "I'd like to see that documentation," Sheriff Rodriguez replied firmly. "And I'd also like to understand why you're so eager to leave when the family has legitimate questions about arrangements that were supposedly made on their behalf." While this conversation continued, Jessica Martinez had been using her cell phone to contact colleagues at the hospital. Her nursing background had taught her the importance of maintaining accurate records, and she was determined to get to the bottom of the transfer documentation discrepancy. "Dr. Wells," Jessica called out, holding her phone. "I just spoke with Linda Chen, the night supervisor who was on duty when Emma was brought in. She said the transfer order was called in by someone claiming to be a family member, but they never produced the required identification or signed the necessary paperwork." This revelation sent a shockwave through the gathering. Hospital transfer procedures were strictly regulated, and any deviation from protocol was a serious matter that could have legal implications. Eleanor McKinney, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, suddenly remembered something important. "Margaret, do you recall that phone call you received 2 nights ago? Someone claiming to be from the hospital, asking about Emma's medical history and insurance information?" Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. "Yes, I thought it was strange because they already had all that information from when Emma was admitted. The caller seemed to be fishing for additional details about our family's financial situation." Sheriff Rodriguez made a note of this information in his pocket notebook. "Mrs. Thompson, did you happen to get the caller's name or department?" "They said they were from billing, but when I asked for a supervisor, they claimed the supervisor wasn't available and said they'd a callback. They never did." Duke's behavior suddenly changed as a new vehicle approached the cemetery. A white van with medical center markings pulled through the gates, and the dog immediately began barking with what sounded like excitement rather than alarm. Dr. Wells recognized the van as belonging to Millbrook General Hospital's emergency transport service. From the van emerged Dr. Patricia Hammond, the chief of pediatrics at the medical center, accompanied by Linda Chen, the nursing supervisor Jessica had called. Their unexpected arrival caused a stir among the gathered crowd, and Robert Blackwood's agitation reached a new level as he desperately tried to start his car engine. "Dr. Wells?" Dr. Hammond called out as she approached, her expression serious, but not grave. "We need to discuss the Emma Thompson case immediately. There have been some very irregular developments that require immediate attention." Margaret Thompson's heart raced as she approached the pediatric chief. "Doctor, please tell me what's happening with my granddaughter. I've been so confused by all these arrangements that I don't understand." Dr. Hammond looked carefully at the assembled crowd before speaking. "Mrs. Thompson, I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding about Emma's condition and her current whereabouts. She was never transferred to Children's Hospital as someone claimed. In fact, she's been in our intensive care unit for the past 3 days, making remarkable progress in her recovery." The impact of this statement was immediate and dramatic. Several people gasped audibly. Margaret Thompson's knees buckled, and Eleanor had to steady her, and Robert Blackwood's car engine finally started with a roar as he attempted to flee the scene. However, Duke had anticipated this move. As the sedan lurched backward, the German Shepherd nimbly jumped onto the trunk of the car, his weight and position making it impossible for the vehicle to gain proper traction. The lawyer was effectively trapped by a dog, who seemed to understand exactly what was happening. "Sheriff," Dr. Hammond continued, "we have security footage from the hospital showing someone we didn't recognize accessing Emma's medical files and making unauthorized phone calls from our administrative offices. We believe this person may have been impersonating medical staff to gather information about the Thompson family." Linda Chen stepped forward with a folder of documents. "We've also discovered that several false documents were created using our hospital letterhead, including a fake transfer order and fabricated medical reports suggesting that Emma's condition was far more serious than it actually was." Jessica Martinez felt a wave of relief wash over her as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Her intuition about the transfer documentation had been correct, and her persistence in investigating had helped uncover what appeared to be an elaborate deception. Sheriff Rodriguez approached Robert Blackwood's sedan, where Duke maintained his position on the trunk. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you need to step out of the vehicle and answer some questions about your involvement in this situation." Margaret Thompson, supported by Eleanor and Dr. Wells, looked toward the small white casket that had been the center of so much attention. "If Emma is alive and recovering in the hospital," she asked weakly, "then what exactly is in that casket?" Duke seemed to understand that his mission was nearly complete. He jumped down from the car trunk and trotted purposefully back to the casket, where he began pawing more gently at the latches, as if encouraging the humans to open it and discover the truth for themselves. The moment of revelation was approaching, and everyone present sensed that they were about to uncover the final piece of a deception that had been designed to manipulate their grief and trust for purposes they were only beginning to understand. The weight of Dr. Hammond's revelation settled over the cemetery like a heavy blanket, transforming the somber gathering into something entirely different. Margaret Thompson, still processing the incredible news that her granddaughter was alive and recovering, found herself torn between overwhelming relief and growing anger at the deception that had been perpetrated against her family. Sheriff Rodriguez approached the casket, where Duke continued his vigilant watch, the German Shepherd's tail now wagging slightly as if he sensed that his mission was succeeding. "Before we proceed any further," the sheriff announced to the gathered crowd, "I need everyone to step back while we examine the contents of this casket. This is now part of an official investigation." Robert Blackwood, trapped in his sedan by Duke's earlier intervention and now surrounded by concerned citizens and law enforcement, finally emerged from his vehicle with obvious reluctance. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his earlier confidence completely shattered, and his eyes darted nervously between the sheriff and the various escape routes that were no longer available to him. Dr. Hammond approached Margaret with a gentle but urgent expression. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you should know that Emma has been asking for you. She's been remarkably alert for a child who went through such a medical crisis, and she keeps looking toward the door as if she's expecting someone." These words brought tears to Margaret's eyes, but they also raised new questions. "Doctor, if Emma is conscious and asking for family, why wasn't I notified immediately? And how did this elaborate deception manage to convince us that she had been transferred, or worse?" "That's exactly what we intend to find out," Sheriff Rodriguez interjected as he carefully examined the latches on the small white casket. Duke moved aside to allow the sheriff access, but remained close enough to observe the proceedings with obvious interest. As Sheriff Rodriguez lifted the casket lid, the crowd held its collective breath. Inside, instead of the tragic scene they had expected, they found an assortment of weighted objects wrapped in white cloth, along with several manila folders containing what appeared to be legal documents and insurance papers. Dr. Wells stepped closer to examine the contents, her medical training making her naturally curious about the evidence. "Sheriff, those folders contain documents that someone clearly didn't want to be discovered. This suggests a level of premeditation that goes far beyond simple confusion or miscommunication." Linda Chen, the nursing supervisor, recognized some of the paperwork from her position at the hospital. Those look like insurance claim forms and medical billing documents. Someone has been very busy creating a paper trail for a situation that never actually occurred. Meanwhile, Robert Blackwood's attempts to blend into the background were thwarted by Duke, who had appointed himself as the lawyer's personal guardian. Every time Blackwood tried to edge toward the cemetery's exit, the German shepherd would position himself in the man's path, creating an increasingly comical but effective form of canine law enforcement. Jessica Martinez, energized by the positive turn of events, approached Sheriff Rodriguez with her cell phone. "Sheriff, I've been in contact with the hospital's security department. They have footage of someone matching Mr. Blackwood's description, accessing restricted areas of the medical center over the past week, including the records department and the administrative offices where the false phone calls were made." This information prompted Sheriff Rodriguez to focus his attention directly on Robert Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, I think it's time you explained your involvement in this situation. We have evidence of document falsification, unauthorized access to medical facilities, and what appears to be an elaborate fraud scheme targeting a grieving family." Robert Blackwood's lawyer training kicked in, even as his composure crumbled. "I want to invoke my right to remain silent and request legal representation," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. However, before Sheriff Rodriguez could respond to this request, another vehicle arrived at the cemetery. A silver luxury car pulled through the gates, and from it emerged a woman in her early 30s, wearing designer clothing and dark sunglasses. Several people in the crowd immediately recognized her as Sarah Thompson, Emma's mother, whose absence from the ceremony had been the source of much speculation. Margaret Thompson's expression hardened as she watched her daughter-in-law approach. The timing of Sarah's arrival, combined with everything they had discovered, created a new layer of suspicion that hadn't existed before. "Sarah," Margaret said coolly, "how convenient of you to arrive just as we're discovering that Emma is alive and well at the hospital. I thought you were too devastated to attend your own daughter's funeral." Sarah Thompson removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that showed more calculation than grief. "I heard there was some kind of disturbance at the cemetery," she said carefully, "and I thought I should come to see what was happening." Dr. Hammond stepped forward, her pediatric experience having taught her to recognize when family dynamics were more complex than they appeared. "Mrs. Thompson, your daughter has been asking for you repeatedly over the past 3 days. The nursing staff was told that you were too distraught to visit, but Emma seems to be expecting to see her family." The implications of this statement were not lost on anyone present. If Sarah had been avoiding the hospital while Emma was conscious and asking for her, it suggested a level of detachment that was difficult to explain under normal circumstances. Duke, whose attention had been focused on Robert Blackwood, suddenly turned towards Sarah Thompson with obvious interest. The dog approached her slowly, his nose working actively as if trying to identify a familiar scent. His behavior suggested recognition, though not necessarily of a positive nature. Eleanor McKinney, who had known Sarah since she married into the Thompson family, studied the younger woman's demeanor with growing concern. Sarah, dear, you seem remarkably composed for someone who believed her daughter had passed away. And how did you know to find us here if you thought the ceremony was cancelled? Sarah's response was delayed just long enough to suggest she was formulating her answer rather than speaking from genuine emotion. I've been staying with friends to cope with my grief, she said, and someone called to tell me about the commotion at the cemetery. Sheriff Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing this family reunion, decided to take a more direct approach. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need you to accompany me to answer some questions about the arrangements that were made for your daughter's care. There appear to be some significant discrepancies between what actually happened and what was reported to your family. It was at this moment that Duke made his most dramatic move yet. The German Shepherd suddenly bounded towards Sarah Thompson's purse, which she had dropped on the ground when she removed her sunglasses. With surprising gentleness for such a large dog, Duke used his nose to flip open the purse, revealing its contents to the assembled crowd. Among the usual items found in a woman's purse were several cell phones, a thick envelope marked with the logo of a well-known insurance company, and what appeared to be travel documents, including airline tickets. The implications of these discoveries sent a chill through the gathering as the pieces of a much larger puzzle began to fall into place. Margaret. Thompson's voice trembled with a mixture of hurt and anger as she addressed her daughter-in-law. Sarah, what have you done? And how long have you been planning whatever this is? The confrontation that followed would reveal depths of deception that none of them had imagined possible, with Duke serving as an unlikely detective whose instincts had guided them toward a truth that threatened to tear the Thompson family apart forever. The contents of Sarah Thompson's purse lay scattered on the cemetery ground like evidence at a crime scene, each item telling a story that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of calculated deception. Margaret Thompson stared at the airline tickets in disbelief, her weathered hands shaking as she picked up the envelope marked with the insurance company logo. These tickets are for tomorrow morning, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. A flight to the Cayman Islands for 2 passengers. She looked up at Sarah with eyes that held decades of disappointment and betrayal. Were you planning to tell anyone you were leaving, or were we supposed to discover your absence the same way we discovered your lies? Sarah Thompson's composed facade finally began to crack under the weight of the evidence and the accusing stares of the entire community. Duke, as if sensing the shift in emotional energy, positioned himself between Sarah and the cemetery exit, his intelligent eyes fixed on her with unwavering attention. Sheriff Rodriguez carefully collected the scattered items, handling them as potential evidence while maintaining a calm, professional demeanor. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need you to explain these travel documents and their connection to your daughter's medical situation. The timing appears to be more than coincidental. Dr. Hammond, who had been quietly processing the implications of what they had discovered, stepped forward with a grim expression. Sheriff, I think there's something else you need to know. When we reviewed Emma's medical records more carefully, we discovered that her condition was actually improving rapidly from the moment she was admitted. The medical reports that were circulated to the family painted a much more dire picture than what was actually documented in her official charts. This revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Are you saying that Sarah knew Emma was going to recover, but she allowed us to believe otherwise? It appears that way, Dr. Hammond confirmed. Someone with access to Emma's medical information was providing false updates to the family while simultaneously working with outside parties to create documentation that would support insurance claims based on a fabricated medical crisis. Robert Blackwood, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly found his voice. I want to make it clear that I was hired to provide legal services, he said desperately. I wasn't aware of the full scope of what was being planned. Sheriff Rodriguez turned his attention to the lawyer with obvious skepticism. Mr. Blackwood, we have security footage of you at the hospital on multiple occasions. What legal services required you to access medical records and impersonate hospital staff? Before Robert could answer, Duke made another significant discovery. The German Shepherd had been investigating the area around Sarah's car and had found something that caught his attention. Using his nose to flip open the vehicle's trunk, which had been left unlocked in Sarah's haste, Duke revealed several suitcases, packed with clothing and personal belongings, along with a laptop computer and additional files. Jessica Martinez, whose nursing background had made her particularly sensitive to the ethical implications of the situation, approached the open trunk with professional curiosity. "This looks like someone was preparing for an extended absence," she observed, "and that laptop might contain additional evidence of how this scheme was coordinated." Eleanor McKinney, who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror, finally addressed Sarah directly. "Sarah, I've known you for 5 years. I watched you marry Margaret's son. I was there when Emma was born. I've seen you at church every Sunday. How could you do this to your own daughter and family?" Sarah's response was cold and calculated in a way that shocked even those who had begun to suspect her involvement. "You have no idea what it's like to be trapped in this small town with no opportunities and no future," she said bitterly. "Emma's medical situation presented an opportunity to start over somewhere else, and I took it." The callousness of this statement sent a wave of revulsion through the gathered crowd. Margaret Thompson, supported by Eleanor, looked at her daughter-in-law with a mixture of disgust and pity. "An opportunity? You saw your sick child as an opportunity?" "The insurance policy was substantial," Sarah continued, her words becoming more reckless as her situation deteriorated. "And with the medical bills that were being generated, it would have been easy to justify the claims. Robert helped me understand how to structure everything so that it would appear legitimate." This confession provided the missing pieces of the puzzle that Sheriff Rodriguez had been trying to solve. "So you and Mr. Blackwood conspired to create false medical documentation, file fraudulent insurance claims, and stage a funeral for a child who was actually recovering in the hospital?" Duke, who had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of a highly intelligent animal, suddenly began barking in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. Dr. Wells, who had been observing the dog's behavior throughout the crisis, realized that Duke's actions had been consistently protective and purposeful. "Sheriff," Dr. Wells said thoughtfully, "I think Duke may have been trying to protect Emma from the beginning. His behavior suggests he somehow understood that she was in danger, not from her medical condition, but from the people who were supposed to be caring for her." Linda Chen, the nursing supervisor, had been reviewing the timeline of events on her phone. "Dr. Wells, you might be right about that. According to our records, Duke first appeared at the hospital the same night that the false transfer calls were made. He was found in the pediatric ward, specifically near Emma's room." This information added another layer to the mystery surrounding Duke's involvement. The German Shepherd was clearly more than just a stray dog who had wandered into the situation by chance. Margaret Thompson, despite her emotional exhaustion, found herself drawn to Duke. As she approached the remarkable animal, he gently nuzzled her hand and looked up at her with eyes that seemed to convey both intelligence and compassion. "Whoever you belong to," Margaret said softly to Duke, "you've been watching over Emma when her own mother wasn't. I don't understand how you knew what was happening, but I'm grateful you were here to help us discover the truth." As if responding to her gratitude, Duke walked purposefully back to the area where Sarah's purse contents were scattered and gently picked up a business card that had fallen unnoticed among the other items. He carried it directly to Sheriff Rodriguez, dropping it at the officer's feet. The business card belonged to a private investigation agency specializing in insurance fraud, and it contained handwritten notes that would prove to be the final piece of evidence needed to understand the full scope of the deception that had been perpetrated against the Thompson family. The truth was finally emerging, but the emotional cost of these revelations would leave lasting scars on a family that had been manipulated by someone they trusted, with only a loyal German shepherd standing between them and a tragedy that could have destroyed them forever. The business card that Duke had retrieved contained more than just contact information for the private investigation agency. Sheriff Rodriguez studied the handwritten notes on the back with growing amazement as the final pieces of the conspiracy came into focus. The notes detailed a comprehensive plan to document suspicious activity related to insurance fraud, with specific references to the Thompson case and Sarah's involvement. "This is remarkable," Sheriff Rodriguez said, holding up the card for the others to see. "These notes indicate that someone has been investigating this fraud scheme for weeks, possibly longer. Duke didn't just stumble into this situation by accident." As if summoned by the sheriff's words, another vehicle approached the cemetery gates. A modest pickup truck pulled into the parking area, and from it emerged a man in his 60s, wearing the uniform of a hospital security guard. His weathered face showed both relief and concern as he surveyed the scene before him. Duke immediately abandoned his protective position and ran toward the newcomer, his tail wagging with unmistakable joy and recognition. The reunion between dog and owner was touching to witness, providing a moment of warmth amid the darker revelations that had dominated the day. "That's Duke's owner," Dr. Hammond said with obvious relief. "That's Frank Morrison, our head of hospital. Security. I wondered where Duke had disappeared to after Frank's shift ended yesterday." Frank Morrison approached the group with Duke at his side, his expression serious but grateful. "Sheriff Rodriguez, I'm glad you're here. Duke and I have been working together to gather evidence about the insurance fraud scheme that's been targeting families in our community." Margaret Thompson looked at Frank with new respect and curiosity. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying that Duke is trained for this kind of work?" Frank smiled proudly at his canine partner. "Duke is a retired police dog who specialized in detecting deception and protecting vulnerable individuals. When I noticed irregularities in the hospital's security systems and suspicious activities around the pediatric ward, I began investigating with Duke's help. We discovered that Emma was never in the critical condition that was being reported to her family." This explanation illuminated Duke's remarkable behavior throughout the crisis. His protective instincts, his ability to detect deception, and his persistent efforts to prevent the false burial all made sense in the context of his professional training and Frank's investigation. Dr. Wells approached Frank with professional interest. "How long have you been investigating this situation?" "About 3 weeks," Frank replied. "It started when Duke alerted me to unauthorized access in the medical records department. Someone was using stolen credentials to access patient files and create false documentation. When we tracked the activity, it led us to discover that several families had been victims of similar schemes." Sarah Thompson, who had been listening to this explanation with growing panic, made a desperate attempt to reach her car. However, Duke's training kicked in immediately. The German shepherd moved with professional precision to block her path, his demeanor shifting from friendly companion to focused working dog. "You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Thompson, Sheriff," Rodriguez said firmly as he approached with handcuffs. "You're under arrest for insurance fraud, falsification of documents, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." As Sarah was taken into custody, Robert Blackwood realized that his own situation was equally precarious. The evidence against him was substantial, and his cooperation with the investigation might be his only hope of avoiding the most serious charges. "Sheriff," Robert said with obvious desperation, "I'm willing to provide information about other cases if it helps my situation. Sarah Thompson wasn't the only client who approached our firm with these types of schemes." Margaret Thompson, despite the emotional turmoil of the day, found herself most concerned about Emma's well-being. "Dr. Hammond, when can I see my granddaughter? I need to make sure she's truly safe and recovering." "We can go to the hospital right now," Dr. Hammond assured her. "Emma has been asking for her grandmother repeatedly, and I think seeing you will be an important part of her healing process." Frank Morrison and Duke accompanied the group as they prepared to leave the cemetery. The fake funeral had been completely dismantled, the false documents collected as evidence, and the truth finally revealed. However, the emotional impact of the deception would take much longer to heal. As they walked toward their vehicles, Eleanor McKinney expressed what many of them were thinking. "It's hard to believe that someone could use their own child's medical situation for financial gain. What kind of person does that?" Jessica Martinez, whose nursing background had given her insight into family dynamics during medical crises, offered her perspective. "Unfortunately, financial stress can bring out the worst in people. But what's remarkable is how the community came together to protect Emma, even when we didn't fully understand what was happening." The drive to Millbrook General Hospital was filled with anticipation and anxiety. Margaret Thompson sat in the passenger seat of Dr. Hammond's car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she prepared to reunite with the granddaughter she had thought she had lost. Duke rode in Frank Morrison's pickup truck, his head out the window and his ears alert as they traveled through the familiar streets of Millbrook Springs. The German Shepherd seemed to understand that his mission was nearly complete, but he remained vigilant in case his protective services were still needed. When they arrived at the hospital, Duke led the way through the corridors with the confidence of an animal who knew exactly where he was going. The pediatric ward was busy with afternoon activities, but Duke navigated through the hallway directly to Emma's room. Through the window, Margaret could see her granddaughter sitting up in bed, playing with a small toy and looking remarkably healthy for a child who had supposedly been in critical condition. The sight of Emma's bright eyes and animated movements brought tears of relief and joy to Margaret's eyes. "She looks wonderful," Margaret whispered to Dr. Hammond. "How could anyone have convinced us that she was in such serious condition?" "The power of misinformation and emotional manipulation," Dr. Hammond replied sadly. "When people are frightened and grieving, they're vulnerable to being deceived by those they trust." As Margaret entered Emma's room, the little girl's face lit up with recognition and happiness. "Grandma!" Emma exclaimed, reaching her small arms toward Margaret for a hug that would begin to heal the wounds created by days of deception and fear. Duke positioned himself in the doorway, his protective instincts satisfied now that Emma was safely reunited with the family members who truly loved her. The German Shepherd's tail wagged gently as he watched the reunion, his mission as protector and truth-seeker finally complete. The investigation would continue, additional arrests would be made, and the legal consequences of the fraud scheme would unfold over the coming months. However, for Margaret Thompson and little Emma, the most important victory had already been achieved. They were together, safe, and surrounded by people who cared about their well-being rather than their financial value. 3 months had passed since the dramatic events at Millbrook Springs Cemetery, and the small town was still processing the implications of the conspiracy that had been uncovered through Duke's remarkable intervention. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as residents gathered to witness the final sentencing hearing for Sarah Thompson and Robert Blackwood, whose elaborate fraud scheme had ultimately unraveled due to the persistent protective instincts of a retired police dog. Margaret Thompson stood outside the courthouse holding Emma's hand, the little girl now fully recovered and blissfully unaware of the complex legal proceedings that had resulted from her mother's misguided actions. At 18 months old, Emma was walking confidently and babbling happily, her bright eyes taking in the world around her with curiosity and joy. "Grandma, doggy!" Emma exclaimed suddenly, pointing toward the courthouse entrance where Frank Morrison and Duke were approaching. The German Shepherd had become a beloved figure in Millbrook Springs, and Emma's face lit up with delight whenever she saw her four-legged protector. Duke approached Emma with the gentle demeanor he reserved for children, allowing her to pet his head while maintaining the alert posture that had made him such an effective guardian. Frank Morrison smiled warmly at the interaction, proud of his partner's ability to balance professional duty with genuine affection for the people they protected. "How's our little survivor doing today?" Frank asked Margaret, his voice filled with the warmth that had developed between them over the months since the crisis had brought them together. "She's thriving," Margaret replied, her voice still carrying traces of amazement at how dramatically their lives had changed. "The doctors say she's completely recovered from her medical episode, and she's meeting all her developmental milestones beautifully." Dr. Patricia Wells and Dr. Hammond emerged from the courthouse, having just finished providing testimony about the medical aspects of the fraud case. Their professional expertise had been crucial in documenting the extent to which Sarah and Robert had manipulated medical information to support their insurance claims. The judge was very interested in Duke's role in uncovering the conspiracy, Dr. Wells reported to the group. "He's being recognized officially for his service to the community, and Frank is receiving a commendation for his investigative work." Jessica Martinez joined them on the courthouse steps, her nursing uniform indicating that she had taken a break from her hospital shift to attend the sentencing. Over the past 3 months, she had become an advocate for improved security protocols in medical facilities, working to prevent similar fraudulent schemes from affecting other families. The sentencing was fair, Jessica informed them. Sarah received 3 years probation and community service, along with mandatory restitution to the insurance companies. Robert got a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other fraudulent cases. Eleanor McKinney, who had remained Margaret's steadfast friend throughout the ordeal, approached the group with news about the wider community impact. "The story has brought Millbrook Springs together in ways we never expected," she said. "People are more aware of how vulnerable families can be during medical crises, and we've started a support network to help prevent isolation and manipulation." Sheriff Rodriguez, who had overseen the investigation from the beginning, provided an update on the broader implications of the case. Frank and Duke's work helped us identify 5 other families who had been targeted by similar schemes. The insurance fraud network was much larger than we initially realized, but Duke's detection abilities were instrumental in gathering evidence. As they talked, Emma wandered over to Duke and began playing a game of peekaboo around his sturdy legs. The German Shepherd participated patiently, his tail wagging gently as he engaged with the child whose life he had helped protect. The scene was both heartwarming and symbolic of the healing that had taken place within the Thompson family. Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that grey morning at the cemetery. "I never imagined that a funeral I dreaded attending would actually be the beginning of getting my granddaughter back," she said thoughtfully. "Duke somehow knew what we couldn't see, and he refused to let us bury the truth along with our hopes." Frank Morrison looked down at his canine partner with obvious pride and affection. Duke has always had an extraordinary ability to sense when something isn't right. His police training taught him to detect deception, but his natural instincts go far beyond anything we could have trained him to do. The legal proceedings had revealed that Sarah's actions were motivated by financial desperation, combined with an unrealistic fantasy about starting a new life in a tropical location. The insurance money would have funded her escape from what she perceived as the limitations of small-town life, but her scheme had ultimately destroyed her relationship with her daughter and family. Dr. Hammond approached Margaret with a proposal that had been developing over the past few weeks. "Margaret, we've been discussing the possibility of establishing a patient advocacy program at the hospital, and we'd like you to consider being involved. Your experience with Emma's case could help other families navigate medical crises more effectively." The suggestion appealed to Margaret's desire to transform their traumatic experience into something positive for the community. "I'd be honored to help other families avoid what we went through," she replied. "No one should have to question whether their loved ones are receiving honest care and communication." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows on the courthouse steps, the group prepared to go their separate ways. However, the bonds that had been forged during the crisis had created lasting relationships that would continue to enrich their lives. Emma, who had been contentedly playing with Duke, suddenly wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck in an impromptu hug. Duke accepted the embrace with gentle patience, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment of pure affection from the child he had helped protect. "I think Duke knows he's a hero," Eleanor observed with a smile. "And Emma certainly knows. He's special, even if she can't understand exactly what he did for her." Frank Morrison began preparing to leave, but not before making plans for regular visits that would allow Emma to maintain her friendship with Duke. "We'll be patrolling the hospital regularly," he assured Margaret, "and Duke always enjoys stopping by the pediatric ward to visit the children." As they walked toward their vehicles, Jessica Martinez reflected on the lessons learned from the crisis. "This experience taught me that medical professionals need to be more aware of family dynamics and potential red flags. We have a responsibility to protect our patients not just from illness, but from those who might exploit their vulnerability." The drive home to Margaret's house was peaceful and filled with Emma's happy chatter from her car seat. The little girl had no memory of the deception that had threatened to tear her family apart, and Margaret was grateful for that innocence. Emma's future would be built on honesty, love, and the protection of people who genuinely cared about her well-being. That evening, as Margaret tucked Emma into her crib, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of security and hope. The fake funeral had become a real celebration of life. Duke's protective instincts had revealed the truth that humans had missed, and a community had rallied together to protect one of its most vulnerable members. Looking out the window toward the cemetery where their ordeal had begun, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude for the loyal German shepherd who had refused to let them bury hope along with their fears. Duke's courage and Frank's dedication had given Emma the chance to grow up surrounded by people who would always put her welfare above personal gain. Dear viewers, we hope Emma and Margaret's story has touched your hearts as much as it has ours. Their journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest protectors come in the most unexpected forms, and that truth has a way of surfacing when brave souls refuse to give up. We've prepared a special collection of similarly inspiring stories that explore the remarkable bonds between humans and animals and the everyday heroes who make a difference in their communities. You can find this playlist by clicking the link to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you true stories that celebrate courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey.